Imagine a king so powerful that he ruled for 66 years, fathered over 100 children, and built monuments so massive they still stand 3,200 years later. Now imagine that same king literally stopping an entire army with just his chariot and his courage. That's Ramses the Great. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. This pharaoh didn't just build temples, he rewrote history itself. He changed the endings of battles he actually lost. He carved his name over other pharaohs' monuments and claimed their achievements as his own. And the craziest part? It worked. For over 3,000 years, we believed his version of events. But the truth behind Ramses' power is far more shocking than any Hollywood movie could show you. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal 3 mind-blowing facts about Ramses the Great that will completely change how you see ancient Egypt. First, you'll discover the brutal military secret that made him unstoppable on the battlefield. Second, I'll show you the propaganda machine he created that was more advanced than anything we see today. And third, you'll learn about the strange twist of fate that made this ancient king meet modern presidents face to face. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Ramses wasn't just a pharaoh. He was the greatest self-promoter in human history, and his techniques still influenced world leaders today. Let me show you exactly how this happened. Egypt in 1279 BC was already ancient. The pyramids were 1,000 years old. Hieroglyphics had existed for 2,000 years. But the Egypt that Ramses inherited was weak and broken. His father, Seti I, had fought constant wars just to keep Egypt together. Enemy kingdoms surrounded them on all sides. The Hittites from modern-day Turkey wanted Egypt's gold. The Nubians from the south raided Egyptian villages. Pirates attacked ships in the Mediterranean Sea. Egypt was bleeding money and losing territory. When Ramses became pharaoh at age 25, everyone expected him to fail. He was tall and handsome with red hair, which was rare in Egypt. But being good-looking doesn't win wars. The older generals doubted him. Foreign kings saw him as weak. Even his own people weren't sure this young man could save their civilization. Here's the first surprise. Ramses had been training for this moment since he was 4 years old. His father made him a military captain when most kids are learning to read. By age 10, he commanded real soldiers. By age 15, he had fought in actual battles. When he finally became pharaoh, he had 21 years of military experience. But Ramses knew something his enemies didn't understand. He knew that real power doesn't come from just winning battles. Real power comes from controlling what people believe about those battles. And here's the second surprise. Ramses wasn't even supposed to be pharaoh. He had older brothers. They all died mysteriously before they could take the throne. Some historians think this was just bad luck. Others whisper about poisoned wine and suspicious accidents. We'll never know the truth. But we do know that Ramses became crown prince after his brothers' convenient deaths. The moment Ramses took power, he made a shocking decision. He moved Egypt's capital city 400 miles north to a place called Pi-Ramesses. He built an entirely new capital from scratch, with palaces, temples, and massive walls. Why would he do this? Because the new capital put him closer to Egypt's enemies. It sent a clear message. I'm not hiding in the south like my father. I'm coming for you. Now here's where things get really interesting. Year 5 of Ramses' reign. He launched the campaign that would define his entire legacy. He gathered the largest army Egypt had ever assembled. 20,000 soldiers, 2,000 chariots, and 4 full divisions named after Egyptian gods. Their target, the city of Kadesh, in modern-day Syria. The Hittite Empire controlled Kadesh, and they weren't going to give. Itupizili, their king, Muatali II, had assembled an even bigger army, 37,000 soldiers and 3,500 chariots. This would be the largest chariot battle in ancient history. Here's where Ramses made his first massive mistake. He was so confident that he raced ahead with just one division, leaving the other 3 divisions miles behind. The Hittites watched him split his forces and couldn't believe their luck. They were about to destroy the pharaoh himself. What happened? Next sounds like a movie, but it's carved in stone on multiple temple walls across Egypt. The Hittite army surprised Ramses' camp. Thousands of enemy chariots came thundering out of nowhere. Egyptian soldiers panicked and ran. Within minutes, Ramses found himself surrounded by enemy warriors, with his army scattered and fleeing. He was going to die, and Egypt would fall, but then something incredible happened. Ramses grabbed his weapons, jumped on his chariot, and charged directly into the enemy army. Not away from them, into them alone. The ancient inscriptions say he was like a god that day. He shot arrows so fast his hands were a blur. He drove his chariot through enemy lines again and again. He killed hundreds of Hittites personally. His courage was so shocking that his own soldiers stopped running. They turned around and fought. Now here's the truth they don't tell you. Ramses probably didn't fight alone. His personal bodyguard unit, the elite Shurden warriors, fought alongside him. These were foreign mercenaries from the Mediterranean islands, and they were the most feared fighters in the ancient world. But here's the really crazy part. Egypt didn't actually win the Battle of Kadesh. The Hittites held the city. Ramses had to retreat. Thousands of Egyptians died. By any military measure, this was a failure. But Ramses did something that no pharaoh had ever done before. He lied. And he lied so well that we believed him for 3,000 years. Ramses returned to Egypt and immediately ordered his scribes to write about his great victory at Kadesh. But he didn't just write it on scrolls that could be lost or burned. He carved the story on the walls of every major temple in Egypt. Abu Simbel, Karnak, Luxor, the Ramesseum, Abus. Over a dozen temples tell the exact same story of Ramses, the hero defeating thousands of enemies single-handedly. He created the world's first multimedia propaganda campaign. Temple walls were ancient Egypt's television, newspapers, and internet all combined. And Ramses made sure every single person in Egypt saw his version of events. The inscriptions even include direct quotes from Ramses, crying out to the god Ammon for help. "Have I not built you 1,000,000 monuments? Have I not sacrificed thousands of cattle in your honor? Why have you abandoned me, my father Ammon?" It's pure theater. It's designed to make you feel emotion, to make you root for the underdog Pharaoh against impossible odds. And here's the most shocking part. Modern archaeologists found Hittite records of the same battle. The Hittite version is completely different. They say they won decisively, and that Ramses barely escaped with his life. Both sides claimed total victory in the same battle. But Ramses' version is the one everyone remembers because he was the better storyteller. This brings us to an important question. If Ramses lied about Kadesh, what else did he lie about? But if you think that's crazy, wait until you hear this. After the Battle of Kadesh, Ramses did something that proved he was more than just a warrior. He became a genius diplomat. For 15 years after Kadesh, Egypt and the Hittites kept fighting smaller wars. Both empires were bleeding resources. Soldiers were dying. Trade routes were closed. Both kingdoms were getting weaker while their enemies grew stronger. Then in year 21 of his reign, Ramses did the unthinkable. He signed a peace treaty with the Hittites. This wasn't just any treaty. It was the first recorded peace treaty in human history. We have copies in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform. The United Nations building in New York displays a copy of this treaty today because it established principles of international peace that we still use 3,200 years later. The treaty promised eternal peace. Between Egypt and the Hittites, it promised mutual defense. If anyone attacked Egypt, the Hittites would help, and vice versa. It even included an extradition clause for criminals and refugees. But here's the secret that makes this treaty brilliant. Ramses married the Hittite king's daughter. This wasn't a love marriage. This was a political masterstroke. By marrying a Hittite princess, Ramses turned his greatest enemy into family. The Hittite king couldn't attack Egypt without attacking his own daughter and grandchildren. The wedding was spectacular. The Hittite princess traveled to Egypt with a massive caravan of gifts: gold, silver, horses, cattle, and hundreds of servants. Ramses threw the biggest celebration Egypt had ever seen. And then he did something shocking. He carved the entire story of the wedding on temple walls, right next to his battle stories. He made diplomacy look just as heroic as war. But the marriage reveals something deeper about Ramses' character. Remember, he had over 100 children. He had 8 official wives and countless concubines. His favorite wife, Nefertari, had been with him since they were teenagers. Yet he married the Hittite princess not for love, but for power. This is where we see the real Ramses. Not the warrior from the temples, not the hero from the inscriptions, but a calculating politician who would do anything to expand his power. And expand he did. For the next 45 years, Ramses built like no pharaoh before or after him. He constructed or expanded more monuments than any other pharaoh in Egyptian history. Abu Simbel the Ramuseum. Additions to Karnak and Luxor temples. The tomb of Nefertari. The city of Pi-Ramesses. But here's the dirty secret. Many of these Ramses monuments weren't actually built by Ramses. He stole them. Ramses had his workers chisel out the names of previous pharaohs from their monuments and carve his name instead. He claimed credit for buildings that were hundreds of years old. He found statues created by other kings, carved his name on them, and said, "I built this." Archaeologists call this usurpation, but let's be honest, it's theft. It's ancient identity theft on a massive scale. The Temple of Luxor has a perfect example. The entrance is lined with massive statues of Ramses, but if you look carefully at the bases, you can still see traces of the original pharaoh's name underneath. Ramses Cartouche. He literally carved over someone else's accomplishments. Why would he do this? Because Ramses understood something that modern marketers are just learning. Repetition creates reality. If people see a name everywhere, they assume you must be important. If your face is on every statue, you must be powerful. If every temple tells your stories, you must be a hero. Ramses created a brand, and that brand was himself. But the most impressive monument Ramses ever built wasn't in Egypt at all. It was Abu Simbel, carved into a cliff face in Nubia, near modern Sudan. Abu Simbel features 4 massive statues of Ramses, each 67 feet tall. Just his face alone is 13 feet high. Inside the temple, the walls tell the story of the Battle of Kadesh in incredible detail. The whole monument is designed to terrify Egypt's southern enemies. But here's the incredible part. The temple is precisely aligned so that twice a year, on February 22nd and October 22nd, sunlight penetrates 200 feet into the mountain and illuminates the statues of the gods in the inner sanctuary. This includes a statue of Ramses himself sitting among the gods. That's right. Ramses didn't just declare himself a god in words. He literally positioned himself among the gods and used the sun itself. To prove it, the engineering required for this is the ancient Egyptians had to calculate the exact angle of the sun on specific dates, then carve the entire temple at precisely the right orientation. They did this 3,200 years ago without computers, calculators, or even accurate calendars as we know them. And here's a modern miracle that proves how precisely they built it. In the 1960s, when Egypt built the Aswan Dam, it would have flooded Abu Simbel under Lake Nasser. So UNESCO cut the entire mountain temple into blocks and moved it 200 feet higher. When they've reconstructed it, the sunlight phenomenon still works. Just one day off from the original dates. Because they couldn't achieve perfect precision with modern tools, the ancient Egyptians building it the first time were more accurate than modern engineers rebuilding it. This brings us to the most shocking discovery of all. Ramses ruled Egypt for 66 years. Most pharaohs were lucky to rule for 20. Most people in ancient Egypt died before age 40. But Ramses lived to be somewhere between 90 and 96 years old. In ancient times, this was impossible. Or it should have been. When Ramses finally died in 1213 BC, he had outlived 12 of his own sons. His 13th son, Meneptah, became pharaoh at age 60. Imagine waiting 60 years to become king, knowing you'll probably die before you can do anything significant. But here's where the story gets absolutely wild. Ramses' body was mummified and buried in the Valley of the Kings in Tomb KV7. But his afterlife was anything but peaceful. Over the next 3,000 years, his mummy had more adventures than most living people. About 200 years after his death, thieves broke into his tomb and stole his treasures. The priests moved his body to keep it safe. Then they moved it again. And again. His mummy was relocated at least 6 times. Eventually, the priests hid him in a secret cache with 50 other royal mummies, where he stayed hidden for 3,000 years. In 1881, archaeologists found the cache and opened Ramses' coffin. His body was remarkably preserved. You could still see his facial features. His hair, skin, and even his internal organs were intact. But here's the shocking part. His arms were crossed over his chest in a position reserved for kings. Even in death, even after being robbed and moved multiple times, he still commanded respect. The Egyptian government moved Ramses' mummy to the Cairo Museum in 1886. There, tourists could look at the face of a man who had walked the earth 3,000 years ago. But the story doesn't end there. In 1974, archaeologists noticed that Ramses' mummy was deteriorating. A fungal infection was eating away at his ancient skin. If they didn't act fast, one of history's greatest figures would crumble into dust. So, Egypt did something unprecedented. They issued Ramses to a modern passport and flew him to Paris for medical treatment. Yes, you read that right. A 3,000-year-old mummy flew on an airplane with a passport. The passport listed his occupation as king deceased. When the plane landed in Paris, the French government gave Ramses full military honors. A pharaoh who died in 1213 BC received a 1974 military salute from French soldiers. French scientists spent several months treating the fungal infection and studying every aspect of Ramses' body. Their findings were remarkable. Ramses stood about 5 feet 9 inches tall, which was very tall for ancient Egypt. He had red hair, which had turned white with age. His teeth were severely worn down from eating bread full of sand and grit. He had arthritis in his hips and spine. He had terrible dental abscesses that must have caused constant pain in his final years. But here's the most shocking discovery. Ramses showed evidence of multiple battle wounds that had healed. Scars on his bones. From sword cuts. Evidence of arrow wounds. This wasn't just a king who commanded armies from a safe distance. This was a warrior who actually fought. Maybe the Battle of Kadesh story wasn't complete fiction after all. The French scientists also found evidence of hardened arteries, suggesting Ramses probably died from heart failure or a stroke. After 90+ years, his body simply wore out. But the story gets even stranger. When Ramses' mummy returned to Egypt, something unprecedented happened. Millions of Egyptians lined the streets from the airport to the museum. They weren't celebrating a scientific curiosity. They were welcoming home their king. After 3,000 years, Ramses the Great still commanded the loyalty of his people. And here's the final twist. In 2017, Egypt opened a new Grand Egyptian Museum, and Ramses' mummy was moved again. They didn't just put him in a case, they built an entire wing around him. The museum's first major exhibit is dedicated entirely to Ramses and his family. Even in death, Ramses gets the biggest room, the best lighting, and the most impressive display. He's still out competing every other pharaoh. But there's one more secret about Ramses that changes everything. Modern DNA analysis of his mummy revealed something shocking about his children and descendants. Remember how Ramses had over 100 children? Genetic testing shows that many of them intermarried with each other to keep the royal bloodline pure. This practice, common among Egyptian royalty, caused severe genetic problems. Many of Ramses' grandchildren and great-grandchildren suffered from inherited diseases, physical deformities, and early deaths. Ramses' obsession with creating a dynasty actually weakened it. Within 150 years of his death, his entire family line had collapsed. The dynasty he built to last forever barely made it 5 generations. The empire he spent 66 years strengthening began to crumble the moment he died. So what does all this mean? For us today, Ramses the Great teaches us something important about power, propaganda, and legacy. His story isn't just ancient history, it's a playbook that leaders still use today. Think about modern politics. Politicians don't just do things, they control how those things are remembered. They repeat their version of events so many times that it becomes the truth. They put their names on buildings they didn't build and take credit for achievements they didn't accomplish. Sound familiar? Ramses invented modern propaganda 3,200 years ago. But here's what makes Ramses' propaganda different from modern lies. He had the resources to make his lies permanent. When a politician today lies on social media, someone can fact-check them immediately. When Ramses lied on temple walls, that lie was literally set in stone for thousands of years. Imagine if every building in your city had one person's version of history carved into it. Imagine if every public space told stories that made one leader look like a hero. You'd start to believe it, even if it wasn't true. That's the power Ramses wielded. But Ramses also teaches us about the difference between appearance and reality. On the temple walls, Ramses is perfect. He's brave, strong, loved by the gods, and unstoppable in battle. But the real Ramses had constant dental pain from bad teeth. He suffered from arthritis that made walking difficult in his old age. He watched 12 of his sons die before him. His favorite wife, Nefertari, died when he was in his 50s, and he mourned her for the rest of his life. The perfect pharaoh from the monuments was actually a suffering, grieving, aging man. This matters because we do the same thing today. We craft perfect versions of ourselves for social media. We show our highlights, but hide our struggles. We want people to think we're living our best lives even when we're barely holding it together. Ramses was doing Instagram 3,000 years before Instagram existed. Now, let's talk about empire building, because Ramses shows us both the power and the limits of imperial ambition. At its height, Ramses' empire stretched from modern-day Syria to Sudan. Egyptian influence reached across the Mediterranean to Greece and Cyprus. Trade routes brought wealth from Africa, Asia, and Europe. Ramses was one of the largest cities in the ancient world, with a population of over 300,000 people. But all of this depended entirely on one man's willpower. The moment Ramses died, the empire began to shrink. His successors couldn't maintain what he built. Within 100 years, Egypt had lost most of its foreign territories. Within 200 years, the new kingdom had collapsed entirely. This teaches us something crucial. Empires built on one person's charisma can't outlast that person. Modern companies face the same problem. Think about tech companies built around one visionary founder. When that founder leaves or dies, the company often struggles. The vision was never bigger than the person. Ramses' mistake was believing that his strength could be inherited. It couldn't. His sons grew up in luxury and peace. They never faced the challenges that forged Ramses into a warrior and leader. They inherited his empire, but not his hunger. But Ramses got one thing absolutely right. He understood that symbols matter more than facts. The truth is that Egypt and the Hittites fought to a draw at Kadesh, but Ramses made his version of events so visually powerful, so emotionally compelling, and so constantly repeated that his version became the official history. Even today, most history books call Kadesh Ramses' great victory. Think about that. A battle that happened 3,200 years ago is still described using the propaganda of the losing side because that side had better marketing. This has massive implications for how we understand history. We assume that ancient records are objective, but they're not. They're written by winners who want to look good. Every ancient text is propaganda to some degree. Ramses just did propaganda better than anyone else. But here's where Ramses' story gets personally relevant to your life. Ramses spent 66 years building monuments that would make people remember him, and it worked. We're talking about him right now, 3,200 years later. But at what cost? He spent enormous amounts of Egypt's wealth on temples and statues instead of improving his people's lives. He diverted resources from agriculture, infrastructure, and education to build monuments to himself. He worked thousands of laborers to death, carving his name into mountains. After he died, ordinary Egyptians' lives didn't improve. They actually got worse. The economy collapsed. Foreign invasions increased. The golden age of Egypt ended. Ramses built a legacy, but he bankrupted his people to do it. This is a warning for all of us. We can become so obsessed with how we'll be remembered that we forget to actually do good things worth remembering. Modern examples are everywhere. CEOs who focus on their media image instead of treating employees well. Politicians who care more about monuments than about passing effective laws. Social media influencers who craft perfect online personas while their real lives fall apart. Ramses shows us the ultimate emptiness of vanity. Yes, we remember him. But we remember him as a narcissist who lied about his achievements and stole credit from others. That's not the legacy he wanted. Before we wrap up, there's one final thing you need to know. Here's the ultimate irony of Ramses' story. The twist that makes everything we've learned come together in an unexpected way. After spending 66 years trying to control his legacy, after carving his version of events on every temple in Egypt, after stealing credit from other pharaohs and rewriting history to make himself look perfect, Ramses ended up being remembered correctly anyway. Modern archaeology and science revealed the truth. We discovered the Hittite records that contradict his version of Kadesh. We found the original names under his usurped monuments. We analyzed his mummy and found evidence of his ailments and imperfections. We studied his dynasty and found the genetic problems caused by inbreeding. All of his propaganda, all of his lies carved in stone, all of his carefully crafted image, none of it survived scientific scrutiny. But here's the shocking part. Even knowing all of this, even knowing he was a liar and a credit thief and a narcissist, we still call him Ramses the Great. Why? Because despite his flaws, despite his propaganda, despite his lies, Ramses actually was extraordinary. He ruled successfully for 66 years. In a time when most kings were murdered or overthrown within a decade, he turned Egypt from a declining power into the dominant force in the ancient world. He pioneered diplomatic techniques that are still used today. He built monuments that have survived for over 3 millennia. He created art and architecture that inspired civilizations for thousands of years. The propaganda was fake, but the achievements were real. This is the final lesson from Ramses the Great. You can't fake greatness forever. Reality eventually reveals itself. But if you do genuinely great things, people will remember them even when all your lies have been exposed. Ramses wanted to be remembered as a perfect god-king who never lost a battle. Instead, we remember him as a flawed, complex, fascinating human who achieved extraordinary things despite his imperfections. Or maybe because of them. His desperation to be remembered pushed him to build monuments that have lasted longer than any other pharaoh's work. His need to prove himself drove Pangium to expand Egypt's power and influence. His fear of being forgotten made him document his reign so thoroughly that we know more about him than almost any other ancient figure. In a strange way, his worst qualities led to his greatest achievements. And there's one final twist that makes this story come full circle. Remember how we started by talking about Ramses meeting modern presidents? That 1974 trip to Paris wasn't just about medical treatment. It was about respect and recognition. Even in death, even as a mummy deteriorating in a museum, Ramses commanded enough prestige that modern governments treated him like a living head of state. No other ancient figure has ever received that honor. So, here's the ultimate question. Was Ramses the Great actually great? Or was he just great at convincing people he was great? The answer is both. Ramses understood something that most people never learn. Perception and reality feed into each other. If you act like you're important, people treat you as important, which gives you actual importance. If you build as if you're great, future generations remember you as great, which makes you actually great in the only way that matters in the collective memory of humanity. Every temple he built, every statue he carved, every inscription he commissioned was an investment in his legacy, and that investment paid off. 3,200 years later, his name is known worldwide. Museums consider his artifacts their most prized possessions. Millions of tourists visit his monuments every year. Movies, books, and documentaries tell his story again and again. Ramses won. Not because he was a perfect king, not because his propaganda worked, but because he understood that in the end, what matters is not how you're remembered, but whether you're remembered at all. So the next time you visit a museum and see Ramses' stern face staring at you from a 3,000-year-old statue, remember, you're looking at the greatest self-made brand in human history. A man who started as just another prince in a declining empire and ended as one of the most famous people who ever lived. He was a warrior, a builder, a diplomat, a father, a liar, and a legend. He was Ramses the Great. And now you know the truth behind the monuments.